Hi there, welcome back everyone. We do hope that day one has been informative, engaging and useful so far. My name is Amit Kulkarni and I'm Head of Research and Outcomes at the RCSLT. And I'd now like to introduce our final keynote session of the day, which focuses on the use of artificial intelligence in speech and language therapy, considering how AI is already being applied within our field and how this may develop in the future. So we're really delighted to welcome our speaker, Professor Mark Hasegawa-Johnson, to deliver this keynote for us. Mark is a professor of electrical and computer engineering at the University of Illinois and a fellow of the International Speech Communication Association, the Acoustical Society of America, and the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, which, for anyone who isn't aware, is an organization whose impressive mission is to advance technology for humanity. What a fantastic thing that is. Mark's teaching includes a focus on artificial intelligence, speech processing, and speech and image analysis. And whilst his research is varied, a key focus is automatic speech recognition, which includes mathematical modeling of, quite frankly, mind-bending concepts, such as pre-conscious speech perception. His work applies AI in our field where, just to give one example, he led on the development of a speech recognition system for people with cerebral palsy that outperforms human listeners. Moderator for the session is Richard Cave, who's a highly specialist SLT and project manager at the Motor Neuron Disease Association, and someone with a keen interest in the application of tech and AI in our profession. As such, he's collaborated with the likes of Google on a project focusing on voice banking for people with MND. So he's really well placed to carefully consider your comments and questions. So please do send these in throughout the presentation, as we are hoping to have some time for Q&A at the end to consider a few. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Mark.
Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit today about current and potential future uses of AI in speech and language therapy. I'm going to, first of all, give a brief introduction of what is artificial intelligence. There's a lot of information about this in the media and a lot of misinformation. So I want to kind of give my perspective on the reason why I like to study artificial intelligence, the reason why I think that AI can be useful in speech and language therapy and for the patients that you work with. Then I'll spend probably the plurality of the talk discussing AI-assisted screening of voice and speech. So I want to talk a little about, I'll give 4 different examples. I'll talk a bit about Parkinson's, a bit about developmental language disorder, a bit about AI-assisted screening for autism and AI-assisted estimation of intelligibility for dysarthria. And I want to really emphasize here that in all of these areas, the AI is not useful on its own. The AI needs to work in collaboration with human partners. And I want to talk about ways in which that can be accomplished and ways in which that has been accomplished in research and in some cases in deployment. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about a more patient-centric problem, and that is the problem of providing the people, the patients that we work for, access to government and education and employment. So things like assistive technology, how do we actually make how do we make it possible for somebody who has difficulty with their speech to nevertheless interact with society in a healthy and in a healthy and productive manner? First of all, just sort of, as I said, I want to kind of review what is artificial intelligence. And surprisingly, there's no consensus on this in the AI community. Those of us who research AI, many of us want to say that a system is artificially intelligent when it behaves like a human being. Others say that behaving like a human being shouldn't be the measure of intelligence, that in fact we should ask whether the machine can make rational decisions, make decisions that are supported by facts in a rational manner. Other people say that making rational decisions is no good if you can't behave on your own in unknown situations, and so we focus on autonomy. And finally, I want to kind of drill down to what might be the bugaboo. Many people believe that, without thinking about it, intuitively believe that intelligence means being conscious. And I want to talk about ways in which that's not really relevant for most of the research that we do or for most of the application areas of artificial intelligence. Human likeness famously was proposed as the test of intelligence by Turing. Already in the 1950s, he proposed, first of all, that if you had a skilled chess player playing chess against 2 opponents, each of those two opponents was in a different room. One of those opponents was a computer, and one of those opponents was another human being. If the skilled chess player was unable to tell the difference, was unable to tell which of those two opponents was human and which was a computer, then you should say at that point that the computer was intelligent. 2 or 3 years after he first proposed this, he generalized it to say that the test should be conversation. That in fact, if a judge is conversing with two different interlocutors and can't tell which of them is the computer and which is the human, that in that case you should say that the computer is intelligent. And when I first started teaching about artificial intelligence, we said that there are many systems that can pretend to be human, but none of them pretend very well, and that the Turing test will never be surpassed. And obviously, last year I had to completely change the way I teach that fact, because there are many computers now that can fool human beings into thinking that they are other human beings. And they do that remarkably well by using a technique that Emily Bender and Timnit Gebru have called the stochastic parrot, where essentially what the computer is doing is memorizing the internet. And given that memorization of the internet, given a prompt, the computer responds with the sequence of text that a well-read human would have said in response to that prompt. So it behaves like a human being by literally memorizing the way in which human beings would behave. And so we need to ask then, is that intelligence? And to be honest, there are people who say yes, and there are people who say no. Another criterion for intelligence then might be simply, does the computer perform in a manner that's justified by facts? So we say that rationality is the principle of being able to decide what to do based on the facts that are available, and that's a useful criterion because it allows us to decide, for example, if an elephant is intelligent or if a robot is intelligent. Closely linked to rationality is autonomy, the ability to simply perform tasks in an unpredictable environment that was not foreseen by your creators. And the problem with all three of those criteria is that they seem somehow unsatisfactory to most of us. Most of us who are raised on the popular media think that if an agent is human-like and rational and autonomous, that doesn't determine whether the machine is intelligent or not. And I think that I want to blame our lack of knowledge on this fact on Mary Shelley, actually, who originally created a novel that you might have heard of. The story of Frankenstein is essentially the story of a man who creates an artificial device. Biological in this case, although the novel doesn't say how he created the device. He creates an artificial device that can make decisions on its own. It can perform autonomously and rationally, and it can convince others that it's human-like. And it convinces others that it's human-like so skillfully that the author of the story believes that this artificial device is conscious of itself as an individual with feelings and goals and in a sense rights. The author of the novel is arguing that that Frankenstein's monster should have rights because it's intelligent. And what we're discovering in the past couple of years is that a device can convince people that it's human without having anything inside it that we would call consciousness, without being aware of itself as an entity separate from the rest of the world. Most of the artificial intelligences that you interact with online, even if they can convince you that they're human, they themselves would not say that they're human. They themselves don't have any internal consciousness of themselves as an entity separate from the rest of the world. And so I want to argue that whether a device is conscious or not is more or less irrelevant to the goals of artificial intelligence. Our goals in building artificial intelligence are to provide new capabilities to human beings. And we want to do so. In a sense, we could say that the artificial intelligence is not an entity, it's a set of capabilities. That kind of brings me to the second subtopic in this first area, and that is sort of the risks and benefits of AI. And I want to kind of argue as I've just been arguing, that the main risks of AI are that people give it more credit than it deserves. People misattribute consciousness to the AI. They believe that it's acting with some hidden goals in mind that have to do with its own existence in the world. And that's simply not true. The programs that we write that then behave like human beings, those programs have goals that the original designers of the program had built into the program. In the case of ChatGPT, its goal is simply to provide you with information. In the case of any of the artificial intelligences in the case of the AIs that I developed, their goal is to provide a spoken language interaction with the human beings who are interacting with their computers. Another misattribution is this misattribution of brilliance. There's a tendency for people to mistakenly believe that the AI is smarter than they are, and it's repeating examples that it knows from the internet. It has a lot of information available to it, but that doesn't make it smarter than you are. That simply makes it a very good encyclopedia. And so I would really encourage people who are using artificial intelligence to think of it as a context-dependent encyclopedia, an encyclopedia that knows how to look up information from the internet based on the query that you give to the AI. And this really gets at the key benefits of AI. AI can store a lot of data. AI can store the entire internet and can make it available to you on demand in response to your questions. And a human decision maker using that data can make decisions faster and or better than those that would be made by a human decision maker without such data. I put the and or here as kind of a joke because many people choose to make decisions faster rather than better, but I would like to encourage you to seek to make decisions that are better than they would have been without the AI. Let me talk a little bit then about the ways in which AI can be used in speech and language therapy. And let me start out by talking about the problem that there aren't enough speech therapists for all of the people who need services. And one of the ways in which we can use AI to help solve that problem is to screen all of the people that we're not currently seeing and to recommend to some of them that they probably should go see a speech therapist. For example, living well with Parkinson's, recent studies suggest that people with Parkinson's don't actually die any earlier than people without Parkinson's. It is no longer considered a fatal disease unless the disease causes cognitive or motor impairments that limit your lifespan. And so treatments that minimize cognitive and motor impairments can provide a person with Parkinson's with a normal and healthy and enjoyable and productive life. But many of those treatments are only possible if the person knows that they have Parkinson's. And so it's useful for us to identify if a person is to identify that a person has Parkinson's. And this is both remarkably easy and remarkably difficult. These are all quotes with conversations that I've actually, so the two human quotes are quotes from people that I've interacted with. The two machine quotes are quotes from people in the technology community. When I talk to trained speech and language therapists, they say that they can tell within the first 30 seconds of a conversation if someone has Parkinson's, because the mono pitch and mono loudness are quite characteristic and quite distinctive if you know what to listen for. On the other hand, for me as an engineer, if I listen to a person with Parkinson's, I don't detect that there's any difference between their speech and the speech of another person of the same age. Similarly, we find similar things in machines, and you can see the two word error rate distributions on the right-hand side. The dashed line, the lighter line, is the distribution of word error rates for healthy controls, for participants who don't have Parkinson's. The solid line is the distribution of word error rates for people who do have Parkinson's. And you can see that the automatic speech recognizer on top, ASR number 1, has quite different error rate patterns for people with versus without Parkinson's disease. And the ASR number 2, the ASR on the bottom, has almost exactly the same error rates for people with versus without Parkinson's. And this seems to depend on the way in which the ASR is trained. And an ASR that's not trained to know about Parkinson's disease will have a significantly higher word error rate in listening to people with Parkinson's disease. On the other hand, an ASR that's trained using data that includes the speech of people with Parkinson's disease can reduce that error rate quite dramatically, so that for most people with Parkinson's, for people who have not whose speech has not degraded quite a lot, the automatic speech recognizer will have no difficulty in understanding them, and may in fact have difficulty, unless it's trained to do so, it might have difficulty detecting whether the person has Parkinson's or not. And so, but if the machine is trained for the purpose of detecting Parkinson's, it can do so reasonably well. The accuracies are not 99%, but across a large number of articles, Parkinson's has been demonstrated to be detectable early in the at the stage of early diagnosis, at the earliest stage that a person might be otherwise diagnosed. a machine that's trained to listen to the speech and to detect Parkinson's from the speech can detect the Parkinson's with accuracies that range from 80 to 94%. The accuracy is somewhat worse over an analog telephone channel, but seems to do quite well actually over digital channels. So if the digital compression is at a sufficiently high data rate, the accuracy is not impaired by that digital channel. And so telemedicine is possible. It should be possible for a person to have a regular checkup as part of their annual checkup, or even a telemedicine checkup where a machine can listen and say, I believe that this person has Parkinson's because I'm detecting monoloudness in this person's voice. That technology has not yet been widely deployed for a number of reasons. And here, these 3 bullet points are really all quoting from an article by my colleague Laureano Moro Velasquez at Johns Hopkins University. First of all, there's this patient privacy laws mean that the data sets that are available for development of these machines tend to be quite small. Large data sets are available, but they only contain proxies like self-diagnosis, which tend to be available much later in the progression of the disease. So the diagnosis accuracy for any one patient can vary quite a lot depending on exactly which patients are in the training set and how similar they are to the patient who's evaluating the device. The curse of small data sets has been solved in several papers by pooling data sets, but then we run into problems of incomparability of different training data sets. So, for example, one study that Laureano quoted in this paper used pooled different data sets, but the data set including people without Parkinson's disease had people who were much younger than the data set including people with Parkinson's disease. And so in that study, there's a high likelihood that the machine was actually learning simply to diagnose age rather than diagnosing Parkinson's disease. And so we need to, I think we're at the point where this technology is ready for clinical trials, and we need to be able to make the clinical trial. And I think that the clinical use case here is, as I just described, that it should be tailored to provide extra information to the clinician. The clinician can listen to the speech and can immediately detect whether they believe that there's Parkinson's or not. It might help to have the second opinion of an artificial intelligence that's been trained with a large number of patients to make a diagnosis of that kind. And so with that sort of principle of artificial intelligence assisting human clinicians, I want to talk about developmental language disorder. In the United States, for example, more than 1/2 of children who qualify under the Individuals with Disabilities Act need speech and language services. Identifying children in need of speech and language therapy is important because early intervention has been shown to improve the child's future in many cases and in many ways. But that's challenging because there just aren't enough speech therapists to see every single child in every single school. A lucky school a lucky school district in the United States has a speech therapist who goes around to the different schools. An unlucky school district is unable to fill that vacancy because there are half of U.S. school districts report teaching vacancies, and among those, speech and language pathology is one of the most frequently reported vacancies. And so one of the proposals that we're working on now, actually, that my group has started working together with a consortium across the U.S. is to try to develop early screening that every child can participate in, simply just to detect, is this child a child whose speech patterns indicate that they probably should go see a speech and language therapist. And one of the therapists that I'm working with at the University of Illinois, Wendy Kroc, has developed an example test that we're working currently on automating. This particular test has the structured diversity priming task that's shown in the figure here was developed essentially for telemedicine and works well for telemedicine. So the problem that they were addressing is that comprehensive language assessment is time consuming and requires the child to actually schedule a meeting with a speech therapist. And so if the child's parents don't notice that there's a problem or don't have time to worry about it, then that child falls through the cracks. And so their idea is, can we develop just a 5-minute or 10-minute screening that will identify children who probably should see a speech therapist and who otherwise would not. This particular test is a series of 24 pairs of images like this, where the clinician, the human being in this, or the AI, currently it's a human being, will point to the picture and say, the baby is drinking. And then we'll point to the next picture and say, what's happening here? And the child might say nothing, or the child might say kitty, or the child might say the kitty is drinking. And if the child doesn't respond, then you point again and say, tell me about the kitty. And again, ask for the child to respond. And the screen is very simple. Of those 24 pairs of images, how many distinct subject-verb pairs did the child produce? If the child produced 22 or 23 distinct subject-verb pairs, then they're way ahead of age average if you're giving this test at age 3. If they produced only 2 or 3 distinct subject-verb pairs, then they're probably behind average and probably should go to see a speech therapist for further diagnosis. Our goal really is to, I mean, this is not available yet, but the goal of our current research project then is to make that kind of early screening available to every child in every school by making it essentially a robot who's giving that test. The AI will say, look, here's a baby drinking. The baby is drinking, and then we'll show a picture of a kitty and say, tell me about this picture, or what's happening here, and record the child's response and count the number of distinct subject-verb pairs that the child produces. This is challenging with current technology because automatic speech recognition, although it works very well for adults speaking without impairment in a majority dialect, it works quite poorly for if any of those 3 conditions is violated. It works quite poorly for people speaking under-resourced dialects. It works quite poorly for people with speech impairments, and it works quite poorly for young children. And so one of our first goals is simply to improve the performance of automatic speech recognition for children ages 3 to 5. Speaking of children ages 3 to 5, those are the years at which diagnosis for autism is usually the most usually the most applicable. Many people, of course, are diagnosed with autism much later in life. Many people as adults are diagnosed with what's sometimes called high-performing autism, where their performance was close enough to modal that nobody ever noticed that they had stereotypical behaviors, or that they had difficulties with social interaction. But again, this is a problem with sort of children falling through the cracks, with children whose parents didn't think to take them to a clinician to be diagnosed. And this is a problem because recent evidence suggests that early diagnosis can lead to significantly improved life outcomes, that people with autism at any level can have a vastly improved quality of life if their parents and the people surrounding them early on in life learn about autism and learn about sort of the social interaction differences that accompany autism, and learn that this is not a disease so much as simply an alternate way of living, and learn how to cope with that alternate way of living. There are, of course, validated instruments. There's an in-person assessment has been called the gold standard. Many people don't have time for an in-person assessment, so the clinician might simply ask the parents a set of questions, and there are ways of doing telehealth assessment. I want to talk in particular about a project that I've come into very late in the project. This is a 5-minute screening developed by a group at Georgia Tech and at Emory University. Opal Osley was the first author, called the Rapid ABC, the Rapid Attention Back and Forth Communication, which is actually just a sequence of 5 activities: a greeting, and then you play with a ball, and then you play with a storybook, and then the clinician puts the book on their head and says, "Oh, look, it's a hat," and essentially evaluating then, not judging, simply evaluating the degree to which the child speaks in response to questions from the clinician, the degree to which the child looks at the book when the clinician is reading from the book, the degree to which the child looks at the clinician and in which they share gaze, the degree of shared or co-referent gestures between the adult and the child. And this is not a comprehensive screening. This is simply a very rapid pre-screening. But what we found is that is that in many cases, children who are later diagnosed with autism can be detected in this rapid 5-minute pre-screening. But the difficulty then comes in explaining to the parents why the clinician believes that the child should have further screening for autism. And one of the things that my colleagues discovered before I came onto the project is that this explanation to the parent can be vastly facilitated by taking a visualization and making that visualization available to both the clinician and the parent. And so here are two of the different visualizations that are used. In the top, we have gesture in green, vocalizations in red, and gaze in blue. The light blue are shared gaze, where the clinician and the child are both looking at the object that's being discussed. In dark blue, we have gaze where the clinician is looking at the child, or vice versa, and you can see that we have the child and the adult on opposite sides. And you can immediately see that anybody who's interacted with people with autism can immediately look at this and say, this is a child who's probably neurotypical, because there's so much shared gaze between the adult and the child, and there's so much shared gaze at the objects that's under discussion. Whereas if there's a significant difference between the child and the adult in their shared gaze, then that's something that you can show to the parent and say, well, this is not a diagnosis, but here's a reason why I believe that your child should have a more formal diagnosis for autism. Another kind of condition that's often diagnosed very early in life, of course, is cerebral palsy. And so I want to talk actually about work that I've done with adults with cerebral palsy. In this case, in 2007 and 2008, we recorded the speech of 17 students at the University of Illinois, primarily people who were living in Urbana-Champaign, who were adults with cerebral palsy, and of a wide variety of different speech abilities. And you can see here that we have people with mid and low and very low intelligibility. Those categories were assigned in this case by asking others who had no particular experience with dysarthria to write down what the person was saying in each of these cases. These are all the same word. These are all the word zero. And you can see that the people with mid-intelligibility and even the people with low intelligibility are producing two distinct syllables. Whereas when you get to very low intelligibility, people whose intelligibility is below 25%, as evaluated by the correctness of the transcription by naive listeners, the two syllables sort of merge into one syllable. Many of these people with very low intelligibility are classified as nonverbal by clinicians at some point. And I find that they're not nonverbal. They simply have enough difficulty getting other adults to understand them that they give up speaking in many cases and work with assistive technology. And yet it's possible for us to develop automatic speech recognition that can understand some of the things that these people say. And with the goal of making the automatic speech recognition, the way that I motivated this in the first part, in the first place, is that for many of these people, when they're talking to their friend or to their mother or to their close, somebody who knows them very well, they can be understood perfectly well. And it's only when they're talking to a stranger that they find that their speech is unintelligible. There have been a lot of significant success stories for people with cerebral palsy going back even to the early 1990s, where people train an automatic speech recognition system specifically for the speech of that person, and the personalized automatic speech recognizer then is able to understand them better than an adult without exposure to that individual. One of the things we've been finding is that it's sometimes useful to give a clinician a so-called objective measure of the intelligibility of a person with dysarthria. And this is, I think the jury is still out on this technology. I think that this is probably a case where 18 individuals is not enough to train such a system. The database, as we distribute it, has a training and test corpora, which each contain speech from the same individuals. And the reason for that is that we were thinking in terms of personalized automatic speech recognition. Many people over the 15 years since the corpus was first distributed have trained then automatic intelligibility assessment using this database. But there was a paper that came out that was published by Martinez et al. In 2016 that showed that, in fact, probably a lot of these papers, and I don't know if it's all of them, but probably a lot of these papers have been showing unrealistically high performance in predicting the intelligibility of a speaker with dysarthria because they're training and testing on the same speakers. They're using different speech, but from the same speakers. And the graphs shown on the right-hand side here are the upper graph is predicting the intelligibility of speech when that same speaker had other speech in the training set. The graph on the bottom shows predicting the intelligibility of the speech of a speaker who's was not represented in the training set. So simply train and test exactly the same software, but in train it using 15 of the speakers and then test it using the other two speakers, and suddenly the accuracy in predicting intelligibility goes down quite a lot. And I think the key problem here is simply that 18 people is not a large enough training set to train a speaker independent system. I haven't gone through all of the papers that have been published in this task to know that all of them suffer from this particular problem, but I think it's something that technologists need to start being aware of, and where we need to start being smarter about the way in which we train and test these systems. So a few preliminary takeaways then. AI-based screening, simply saying, does the person have low intelligibility or not? Does the person have Parkinson's or not? Suffers from out-of-sample generalization errors. And that apparently is caused by the fact that most of the corpora that are available for training systems of this kind tend to be small. On the other hand, even with a small corpus, it's possible to for the AI to generate auxiliary information that can be quite useful to a human clinician who is tasked with actually performing that evaluation. So we can provide, for example, visualizations of the shared speech, gaze, and gesture in a very fast screening for autism. Or we hope that we'll be able to provide information about the subject-verb combinations that a child is using in response to a very fast screening for developmental language disorders. I think I'm going to go on then and talk about the third third of my talk, or the last part of my talk, and that is maybe more patient-centered when the patient, or maybe more assistive technology-centered, when the patient wants to go out and get a job, but has difficulty being understood by adults who are not familiar with their speech. Can we make it easier for that person to interact with society? And my goal here is I'm going to shift gears just a little bit and say that the goal here is really human rights. The project that we're working, the UA speech corpus that I described previously, and the speech accessibility project that I'm going to describe going forward in this part of the talk, is really about human rights. We believe that every person has the right to access public services, and every person has the right to work, and every person has the right to have access to higher education to the best of their ability, and ability should not be constrained by things that can be bridged using artificial intelligence. This was in a recent blog post. I just had to put this up because I love the way that this is described. The Speech Accessibility Project could open doors literally. Our goal literally is to make it possible for somebody to approach a door in a wheelchair and to say, "Door open, please," and the door will open for them. And this has a long history, of course. Speech technology has been used to help people with disabilities since the beginning of speech technology. One of the when Dragon Dictate, the first commercial automatic speech recognizer, required a great deal of training data from the individual before it achieved accuracy that was useful in any way. Some of the people who found it worthwhile to invest their time training the automatic speech recognizer were people with severe motor disorders. Some of the earliest articles, 3 of the earliest articles on automatic speech recognition, testing it with actual users in the real world, were testing it with individuals with cerebral palsy or with other kinds of motor disorders. Jumping ahead, of course, one of the best known individuals who used speech technology to improve his access to the world was Stephen Hawking. I'm posting here just a screenshot from a really interesting blog post describing the way in which Stephen Hawking chose, rather than choosing his own voice, he chose to use the standard voice available in the Perfect Paul speech synthesizer, which was actually a voice modeled after the speech of Dennis Klatt, who, because of laryngeal cancer, was in the process of losing his own voice at the same time that Stephen Hawking started using his voice as his standard mode of interacting with the world. And I just want to point out, I think I mentioned this with regard to drag and dictate, but I just want to point out that this is not a situation where the people with disabilities have been sitting back and relaxing and allowing clinicians to do all the work for them. Jerry Robinson is a human computer interaction specialist with cerebral palsy, who for his doctoral thesis did a study, a phenomenological look at the life hacking enabled practices of individuals with mobility and dexterity impairments, where he did in-depth interviews of 24 people with often severe mobility and dexterity impairments, and studied the ways in which they took the assistive technologies that were available to them and used them for purposes for which the designers never intended, or changed their way of access, or combined technologies, or applied them in ways that were creative and unexpected. The largest amount of results that I have to present on this are including my results and the results of many other teams around the world using the UA speech corpus. I've mentioned already this corpus that we collected of 17 or 18 people with cerebral palsy in Urbana, Champaign in 2007. And also with control participants, people who didn't have any diagnosis of dysarthria or of cerebral palsy, matched for age and gender. And those people read isolated words, computer commands, digits, letters of the international radio alphabet, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, etc. And then a list of the 100 most common words in the English language according to the Brown corpus, and then a list of 300 uncommon words that were selected from selected from novels in order to maximize phonetic diversity. And the participants agreed to make their data available to government and academic researchers, one of the so that research could be distributed more broadly to research teams around the world. And it's been downloaded by hundreds of researchers in more than 30 countries. And one of the reasons that it's been so widely used is that we managed, I shouldn't say we, a couple of very smart people managed to turn this into a kind of an international competition. The first 5 numbers on this graph are actually my own doctoral student, Harshvardhan Sharma, who is part of the initial collection effort for the UA speech corpus. And then you can see that from 2012 to 2013, the best published word error rate on this corpus didn't change, because after Harsh graduated and went to work on other projects, nobody else was working on this corpus. And then there's this number in 2015 where Heidi Christensen at Sheffield found a brilliant new way of using the data in order to dramatically reduce the word error rate. These are word error rates on the test section of the corpus, which is 1/3 of the speech from every individual. The idea was to train the automatic speech recognizer using 2/3 of the speech from every individual, and then test it on the remaining third. Her results stood for another 2 or 3 years, and then groups in Asia started to compete. And since about 2018, I have to say that this has been primarily a competition between research groups at universities in Europe and in Asia, primarily in the UK and in East Asia. There hasn't been very much contribution from groups in the United States, unfortunately, but fortunately, this has turned into an astounding sort of research result, where there are a lot of people working on this corpus trying to significantly reduce the word error rate for people with cerebral palsy. And it isn't across the board. There is still a tendency that people with milder motor impairments, milder speech impairments, are getting much better word error rates out of the automatic speech recognizer. But notice here that even people with low intelligibility are getting word error rates that are now below 20% from the automatic speech recognizer. These are people that, when we take that isolated word that they recorded and we play it to adults who have no experience listening to dysarthric speech, those adults who have no experience listening to dysarthric speech are able to correctly transcribe the word with 25 to 50% accuracy. So these are people with a rather significant speech disability, and the automatic speech recognizer is working quite well for people in that condition. It's not yet working very well for people with the very low intelligibility, but it's down to 50% word error rate. So we are getting results that could possibly be useful in assistive technology. And so we come to sort of the present day. One of the remarkable things about the UA speech corpus is that it remains now the largest speech corpus that can be distributed to technology researchers anywhere in the world of people with dysarthria. And I think that's sort of, in a way, shameful, because it's 2023 that the largest corpus in terms of the number of individuals should have only 17 people with dysarthria. And so I went back and took a look kind of at the history of speech recognizer training corpora. And maybe the reason that this has happened is that the United States government kind of got out of the business of creating large corpora at around the year 2000. In the 1990s, the United States government had several projects whose main goal was to collect corpora that could be used to train automatic speech recognizers. And around 2003, they simply stopped. They said, we've done enough here. We have data that's available to train ASR. The ASR keeps getting better and better. At some point, companies should take over this task. And so companies did start taking over the task. And the problem when companies start taking over the task is that they cannot redistribute the data. Corporate data providers entered the picture and started collecting large and fantastically well curated corpora and then selling them for fantastically high prices. Other companies simply collect data that can be used internally but can't share it externally because their agreements with their customers don't allow them. They haven't asked their customers, can we share this data for free? They wouldn't do so because the customers would say, no, you can't do that. It can't. People don't like to give companies the ability to give their data away. And so a funny thing happened around 2015. The open source movement happened, I guess. And what happened is that people started giving, rather than giving their data to a company or to the US government and allowing the company or the US government to give their data away, people simply started giving away their data themselves. This was the data set that's of particular relevance to automatic speech recognition is a site called LibriVox.org, where people can log into the site and read books. People read books for many different reasons. One of my close friends is a professional audiobook narrator, and she contributed to LibriVox basically as a way of posting a portfolio so that anybody who is considering hiring her as an audiobook narrator can go and listen to her books and see what they sound like. Many other people, I contribute simply because I love audiobooks. Many other people contribute because they love a particular book and they see that it's not yet available for free, and so they want to make it available for free. Or they contribute because they see that there's not yet enough audiobooks available in a particular language, and they want to make those books available in that language. So this happened as part of the open source movement, as part of the idea that that knowledge should be free. And in 2015, a group at Johns Hopkins University said, this is free automatic speech recognizer training data. We should use it as such. And so they went through and curated, they matched up the audio on LibriVox with the corresponding texts from Gutenberg.org. And they curated a set of 360 hours where the audio was particularly clean, and 600 hours where the audio was perhaps not as clean, or where the narrator perhaps read something slightly different from what was in the original Gutenberg text. And they made all of those data available basically as annotations on the original LibriVox audio. It's free to download, free to use, free to distribute. And I would argue that LibreSpeech is the reason that automatic speech recognition has gotten so good since 2015. That essentially for the longest time, we had this question, how much speech data is enough to train an automatic speech recognizer? LibreSpeech answered that question. 1,000 hours of transcribed speech is enough to train a good automatic speech recognizer. All of these are results from one particular paper describing one particular set of ASRs, but these results are in fact, these results are old. These are already 2 years ago. The best results we were getting on the LibriVox corpus were around 2.5%. This year, the best results that are being published on LibreSpeech are below 2% word error rate. So automatic speech recognition has gotten dramatically better because of the availability of this data. And so the goal of the Speech Accessibility Project is to make a similar data set available for people who want to train ASR to help people with speech disabilities. Speech technology is good enough to be useful for people who are speaking general American English or received pronunciation who don't have disabilities. To make it useful for people with disabilities, we need to have transcribed speech that's available to any university or company who is interested in creating a better speech recognizer with good quality and good transcriptions and enough data. And we're trying to collect 1,000 hours of speech from about 2,000 participants. And our goal then is to make this available to any researcher at any university or company who has a good idea that they think might advance the state of the art in dysarthric speech recognition. However, unlike LibriVox, LibriVox is possible because they're drawing on the set of all of the 7 billion people in the world. The group of people who have disabilities is too large, but is a much smaller set. And so we thought that we're probably not going to be able to record speech data if we simply give it away free on the internet. Instead, what we would like to do is to record it and then make it available to researchers who agree to sign a data use agreement. And so what we've done is we have an IRB approved consent form that specifies that this data will be distributed to universities and companies, that the universities and companies to whom it's distributed will sign a binding agreement saying that they will not try to identify any of the individuals in the corpus, saying that they will adopt state-of-the-art methods for protecting against data theft, including organizational, physical, and software methods for avoiding data theft. And we take additional measures also to prevent people from working backward to try to identify participants. We don't distribute participant provided metadata. For example, we do ask people for their race, their ethnicity, their gender, and their geographical location, and we report those statistics in the aggregate over the corpus rather than reporting those statistics for any individual. We also review, we have a human being listen to every single audio file and excise any personally identifiable information. Participants are, of course, told not to include PII, but if they do include something that we judge to be PII, then we excise it. The recruitment strategy is that we're trying to recruit people from 5 different etiologies, from Parkinson's, ALS, Down syndrome, stroke, and cerebral palsy. Other etiologies, people who have speech disabilities from other etiologies will be screened if they volunteer, but we're focusing the recruitment effort really on advocacy organizations and service providers who work with people in those particular 5 etiologies. And as of mid-October, we had 750. We're now closer to 800 people who have been screened, and of those, the number who have actually been approved. More than half of those participants are people with Parkinson's whose speech disability is judged to be within normal limits, and so they're thanked, but I'm told that their speech is too good for us in a sense. But more than 280 have actually been approved as having speech that's affected by their disability. The word error rates vary quite a lot depending on the participant. We find actually that the best results that we're getting so far is by taking an automatic speech recognizer that works well for on LibriSpeech and then fine-tuning it to the set of all people with disabilities, and then testing it on the set of all people with disabilities. In fact, our standard train test split on this corpus includes in the test set none of the speech of any of the people who are in the training set. So the speakers in the training and test set on this corpus are distinct. So the key points then that I wanted to discuss in this talk are that first of all, AI is, I think that we should start working toward closer and more continuous collaboration between technologists and clinicians, because AI can provide context-sensitive data on demand that can help you to make better decisions. Binary diagnosis should be treated as pre-screening. It can be useful when there simply aren't enough speech therapists to see every individual. But I want to advocate for the idea that the AI should provide more information to the clinician about why it made the binary diagnosis, or perhaps even the AI should not provide a binary diagnosis. It should provide additional information to the clinician that the clinician can use to make his or her own judgment, or to communicate with the parents if the person being evaluated is a child. And in parallel with those automatic screening technologies, I want to advocate for the use of artificial intelligence to improve access to people with disabilities, to make it possible for a person whose whose speech is unintelligible for adults without exposure to dysarthria, to make it possible for that person to interact with people in the real world without barriers. Thank you.
Gosh, Mark, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. And looking at the Q&A, looking at the questions, like, oh my God, we've got hundreds of questions here, which is just wonderful. And I just want to say thank you, particularly for your last point. I think collaboration of technologists and speech and language therapists and other clinicians is something we have to do more, because we can help each other. And actually doing it by ourselves is nowhere near as good as doing it together. And also your also kind of final point about this is about accessibility. It's about inclusion. It's about leveling the play field for everyone. And that was a key point for you as well. So I'm going to move to the questions. There are so many, but hopefully we'll get through some. So in kind of no particular order, the data on AI screening for Parkinson's is very interesting. But is there any information on false positives? Could screening generate false flagging of Parkinson's?
Yes, it certainly can. So the 79 to 94% that I quoted is a range that I've seen across a number of different articles, and in most of those articles are set up with a test corpus which is 50% people with Parkinson's and 50% people without. And so for the most part, those errors will be pretty uniform. That the sensitivity and the selectivity will both be at around the same rate, 80 to 90%. The system can be tuned one way or the other, but the fewer false negatives you have, reducing the number of false negatives usually increases the number of false positives. Okay,
lovely, thank you. And another question, kind of more of a statement, really, that there's more to assessing a child than just getting answers from them, and that, you know, is any of your presentation talking about replacing any of the speech therapist assessments, or kind of how are you positioning this type of work versus the work that speech therapists do?
Right. I would maybe refer to the first bullet point on my last slide, that you have to use your common sense because the machine has none. There are the machines can sometimes be we can sometimes say that the machine is more accurate than a human, but the machine will make mistakes that are of a kind that a human would never make, because the machine is simply looking at the examples that are in its training data and trying to find the closest match to the person sitting in front of it. And for that reason, a machine will make mistakes that are obviously mistakes when a human stops to interact with the same individual. And so that's why I really want to advocate for sort of a team approach where the machine provides information to a clinician who then is responsible for making the final judgment.
Thank you. Another participant said that they love the idea of technology supporting diagnosis and intervention. However, we live in a world where there's hefty media coverage of ChatGPT and all the other stuff, implying, and the implication is that it's accurate when it's actually no more than data gathering. And I think you talked about data gathering from what is available, and therefore by implication not necessarily correct or accurate. And are there ways to make it more accessible for people without a tech background to support them, to know what's worthwhile tech and what is inaccurate? And, you know, perhaps we could ask that question.
Yeah, that's actually proven to be surprisingly difficult. So, I mean, what I would say right now is that you should only trust what you get from the AI if you can evaluate its quality. So for example, if you have an AI that's writing an essay for you, you can immediately evaluate yourself whether the writing quality is good. But if you can't evaluate whether the facts that are presented are correct, then you'd better not trust them, because it has been surprisingly difficult to ask an AI to produce confidence scores on the data that it provides. It's even been somewhat challenging to ask it to produce references specifying where it got the information that it provides. You would think that these would be obvious because these are things that humans do naturally. A human can immediately say whether they're confident about the judgment they're providing, and they can immediately provide you with references to the place where they got that information from, even if the references are kind of fuzzy. Machines have had surprising difficulty in doing so. There is a lot of research right now on trying to have machines provide citations for the facts that they report, but it's still, as of today, it's still an unsolved problem.
Thank you. Another person said, really interested in your AI assessment of the 3-year-olds, typically developmental speech sound simplification. In the absence of speech sound impairments that intelligibility is reduced, have you considered training AI on those processes to improve effectiveness with toddlers?
I'm not sure if I understand what those processes refers to.
I don't think I actually put it right either. So really interested in your AI assessing the 3-year-olds. Typically developmental speech sound simplification process can be so evident in the absence of speech sound impairments. Have you considered training AI on those processes to improve effectiveness with toddlers?
Yes, we are. So I guess we're sort of targeting 2 distinct kinds of disability in that project. One is the sound simplifications where some phonemes may not be correctly produced, or perhaps the child has learned the phonemes but is not using them, is not performing morphosyntax correctly. And then the other is where the child is simply not producing speech, perhaps because the child doesn't yet have a large vocabulary, or perhaps because the child has not yet quite grasped the idea of syntax, the idea that a verb should follow a subject. And those are very different things, but I think that the speech recognizers that can solve those problems are closely related. Not exactly the same thing, but similar technologies can be used to work on both problems. So we're trying to develop technologies right now that can be used to address both problems.
Lovely. Here's a lovely question. It says, I think there's a concern that screening of this nature using AI risks creating a situation where individuals receive a diagnosis or get a sense that they're receiving a diagnosis without recognition that news like this needs to be imparted sensitively and in a considered way, i.e. with the support of trained clinicians. And there's also a risk that our contribution as speech therapists gets lost by service providers such as education boards, and our position is diminished. How can we ensure that the positioning of AI in this work is sensitively managed and considered by all those that are involved?
Yeah, that is a risk, and the only solution to that I know of is that those of us who are in these collaborative relationships need to design research trials and clinical trials that really present the technology in a responsible way. The technology should not be simply listening to the child and then giving the parents a printout without any context or without any that shouldn't happen. I would prefer, for example, that the technology is under the control of the speech therapist in that school district, who will then look through the records of the children who have gone to talk to the robot today and say, oh, maybe I really should be talking to this child because that child seems to have some difficulty talking to the robot. You don't know whether the child is simply having difficulty because it's a robot, or whether the child is having difficulty because the child has a developmental language disorder. And I think a human needs to be in the loop there somehow in order to determine which of those two is going on. There's been a lack of research trials and clinical trials that include both technologists and speech therapists, and I think there need to be more of those.
Yeah, I think you make a lovely point that the way we interact with something that looks like a robot may not be exactly the same as somebody that is a person. And onto speech recognition. So for automated speech recognition, there's been quite a lot of research for speakers with dysarthria. But how much has been done for speakers with apraxia of speech who will have likely a more inconsistent motor speech production?
Yeah, much less, unfortunately. I have seen papers looking at apraxia. I think that part of the reason that little has been done on apraxia of speech is that I don't know of any data set that can be redistributed that has that can be distributed that has recordings of people with apraxia of speech. We've looked into the possibility of trying to recruit people with apraxia of speech for the Speech Accessibility Project, for example, but there doesn't seem to be this sort of patient advocacy networks that exist for something like cerebral palsy or Parkinson's disease that would allow us to reach hundreds of people with that particular disorder.
Yeah. And I guess that's always going to be a challenge for something like automated speech recognition. Another area which I'm particularly personally interested in is what progress, if any, has been made with automatic recognition for stuttered or stammered speech?
Quite a lot. Yeah, I actually have done a little bit of work in that, but there are other labs that are doing a lot more. There are some remarkable results looking at, for example, simply detecting which frame in an utterance is a stammer, and simply zeroing out that part of the signal and then passing it to the automatic speech recognizer. That, for example, is a technology that seems to improve the transcription coming out pretty well. It's difficult, again, to collect speech of people who have a pathological stutter because there are fewer of them. There are corpora specifically of people who have pathological stutter, but you can also make some advances in this area by simply taking the stutter that all of us have, that that fluent speakers have all the time, and using that as examples to train a system that knows how to cope with stutter. And in some cases, some of the things that you learn can be transferred to people who have a stutter that's considered more pathological.
Yeah, I guess it's a very sensitive area when we talk about screening out blocks and stutters, because actually, often
in this case,
people...
I think this is one of those cases where there's a very clear criterion for what you should include in the transcript. The criterion is you should include the things that the person using the device wants to have in the transcript. If the person doesn't want those stutters to appear, then we should try to remove them. If they do want those stutters, then we should try to include them.
Okay, so it's a very personal thing. Thank you. Oh, voice banking, how exciting. One of the current limitations of voices on ASE devices include voice bank voices, including voice bank voice, is a lack of the ability to vary intonation. For example, emotional display. Is this something that AI may be able to help with now or in the future?
That's a great idea, actually. Yes, you're right. The problem with intonation is not so much that we have trouble changing the pitch of the speech that we're reconstructing. The problem is that we don't know where to change the pitch. And most systems are still using sort of rule-based methods based on manual linguistic analysis of prosody. The idea, what I gleaned from the question that I hadn't previously thought of is the idea that a generative AI like a GPT kind of thing might be able to generate more realistic prominence patterns.
Yeah,
I have not seen research in that area yet, but it's a good idea.
Yeah, I love that question because voice bank is all about identity and emotion is part of that. For the study you mentioned, the 5 etiologies and the 400 subjects each, how about different languages? Will you be able to kind of look at different languages such as Portuguese, as this person mentioned?
We would love to. We don't currently have concrete plans to do that, though. So the project right now is going on for another year, and in that time, we're spending almost all of my waking hours thinking about how to recruit people in the United States.
Okay, lovely. You know what? We're 5 minutes over, and actually, we could have easily been an hour over if we would just carry on. It's been such an interesting conversation. So thank you so much, Mark, and I shall hand back over to you, Amit.
Thank you so much to both of you for such an engaging session on a hugely important topic. It's so great to hear about these developments, but also really the kind of genuinely responsible way you propose the technology is used. And I think that is core to this. And this particularly on a day when the UK government is convening international talks on this area. So thank you also to our delegates for participating. We know some of the sessions have been challenging to participate in, but we thank you for your patience in managing this. And we very much look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow at 9:30 for our second and final day of this year's RCSLT conference. So have a lovely evening all, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you very much.